CEO John's one-night stand shocks him. The girl he abandoned returns with his secret child. Welcome, dear viewers. I am so incredibly happy to see all your wonderful comments on my last story. Your love, support, and connection with me and this channel, Beyond Color Stories, mean the world to me. Every word you share, every emotion you express, makes this storytelling journey even more beautiful. May your hearts always be filled with love, your days with joy, and your nights with peace. May you always find happiness in the little moments and strength in every challenge life brings your way. Before we dive into today's heartfelt story, I want to hear from you. What was your favorite moment in the last story? And tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your answers in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories reach across the world. Now let's begin today's story. And let the emotions take over. The night was painted in hues of deep blue and silver, as the city lights shimmered like scattered diamonds across the skyline, illuminating the world below with an ethereal glow. The air carried a crisp edge, but inside the penthouse suite, warmth reigned. An intoxicating heat that had nothing to do with the controlled temperature of the room, and everything to do with the two souls tangled in an embrace that neither of them had planned. Yet neither of them could resist. John Montgomery, the cold, ruthless CEO known for his calculated precision in business, a man feared and revered in equal measure, found himself lost in a moment that defied all logic, all control. Stuart Hayes was unlike anyone he had ever touched. Her skin soft, like silk beneath his fingertips, her scent a delicate mixture of jasmine and vanilla. Embedding itself into his senses like an addiction he had no intention of fighting, at least not tonight. His lips, usually pressed into a thin, unreadable line during board meetings, were now trailing fevered kisses along her bare shoulder, his breath hot against her skin as she arched into him, her soft moans echoing in the dimly lit room. Their clothes had long been discarded, forgotten in the whirlwind of passion that had overtaken them, leaving them with nothing but the heat of their bare skin pressed together, the erratic thumping of their hearts beating in sync like a melody only they could hear. John had never felt this way before, not with any of the women who had thrown themselves at him, not with any of the carefully selected dates he had entertained for the sake of appearances. This was different. Stuart wasn't just another woman in his bed. She was fire and softness, a contradiction that made him want to lose himself in her over and over again. His hands roamed her body with a reverence he hadn't known he was capable of, tracing every curve as if memorizing her, as if branding her into his very soul. And Stuart, she responded to him in ways that left him breathless, her hands gripping his hair, her nails digging into his back, as she surrendered to the passion consuming them both. Their lips met again and again, hungry, desperate, as if they were afraid this moment would slip through their fingers before they had the chance to fully grasp it. John wasn't a man who lost control, but with Stuart, control had never been an option. He was drowning in her, in the way her body moved against his, in the way she whispered his name like it was the only word she knew, in the way she looked at him with those deep, expressive eyes that held something he wasn't ready to name. The world outside ceased to exist. There were no boardrooms, no business deals, no ruthless negotiations. There was only her. Only this moment, only the burning need that refused to be satisfied, no matter how many times he claimed her. He didn't know how long they spent lost in each other, how many times they reached the heights of pleasure, only to fall right back into the cycle of hunger and need. All he knew was that when exhaustion finally wrapped around them, pulling them into a haze of satisfaction and lingering desire, He found himself unable to pull away from her warmth, his arm draped over her waist, pulling her closer as she rested her head against his chest, her breath warm against his skin. It was an unfamiliar feeling, this quiet intimacy, this need to keep her close, even after the fire had momentarily dimmed. John Montgomery didn't do intimacy. He didn't do emotions. He was a man who took what he wanted and moved on, untouched, unaffected. But as he lay there, staring at the ceiling, while the soft rise and fall of Stuart's breathing filled the room, something inside him twisted, something unfamiliar and dangerous. He could feel it in the way his fingers absent-mindedly traced patterns on her back, in the way he wanted to memorize, the way she fit against him, in the way he found himself wondering what it would be like to wake up to this warmth every morning. The thought alone was enough to send a ripple of panic through him. He wasn't built for this. He wasn't meant for quiet mornings filled with whispered affections or lazy nights wrapped in the arms of a woman who could make his heart stutter with a single look. And so, as dawn began to break, casting a soft golden glow through the sheer curtains, John made a decision, one he knew would be cruel, one he knew he would regret, but one he convinced himself was necessary. Carefully, he untangled himself from Stuart's embrace, his movements slow, calculated, ensuring she wouldn't wake. His gaze lingered on her for a moment, on the peaceful expression she wore, on the way her dark lashes fanned against her cheeks, on the way her lips, now swollen from his kisses, parted slightly as she breathed. His chest tightened, an unfamiliar ache settling deep inside him. But he ignored it. He reached for his clothes, dressing in silence, his every movement filled with the same precision that had made him the success he was. The scent of their night together still clung to the air, a reminder of the passion they had shared, of the connection he was now walking away from. As he reached the door, he hesitated, his fingers curling around the handle, his jaw tightening. He didn't want to leave, and yet he did. Because John Montgomery didn't do love, he didn't do commitment, he didn't do forever. Without another glance, he slipped out of the room, leaving behind nothing but the lingering scent of his cologne, and a heart he didn't realize he had just broken. The golden rays of the morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a warm glow across the luxurious hotel suite, but the warmth did nothing to soothe the growing chill in Stuart's heart as she slowly stirred awake. Her body ached, a pleasant reminder of the passion she had shared with John the night before, but as her fingers instinctively reached across the bed, seeking the familiar warmth of his presence, her heart lurched violently when all she felt was the cold, empty sheets beside her. Her eyes snapped open, a soft gasp escaping her lips as she sat up, clutching the covers against her bare body, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was silent, too silent, and with every passing second, the sinking realization that she was alone wrapped around her like a suffocating vice. She turned her head, scanning the dimly lit space, hoping, praying that he was simply in the bathroom or standing by the window, gazing out at the city like he'd done last night. But deep down she already knew the truth. He was gone. Just like that, as if the night they had shared, the fire that had burned between them, had meant nothing at all. A lump formed in her throat, her fingers gripping the sheets so tightly her knuckles turned white. No. This couldn't be happening. Last night had been real. It had been more than just passion, more than just lust. She had felt it in the way he touched her, in the way he whispered her name against her skin, in the way his lips had trembled against hers, as if he were afraid of the depth of what they were sharing. It hadn't just been about pleasure. It had been about something deeper, something unspoken, something she had dared to believe was more than just a fleeting moment. And yet, The cold emptiness beside her told a different story. He had left, without a word, without a note, without so much as a lingering trace of warmth where his body had once been. Only the faint scent of his cologne lingered in the air, teasing her senses like a cruel reminder of what had slipped through her fingers. Why? Why had he left? Had she been nothing more than another conquest to him, another notch in the belt of John Montgomery, the powerful, ruthless CEO who had the world at his feet and no time for emotional entanglements? The thought made her stomach twist painfully, bile rising in her throat as she forced herself to swallow the sob threatening to escape. She clenched her jaw, shaking her head furiously, refusing to let the tears spill. Number she wouldn't cry. She wouldn't let him have that power over her. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, gripping the sheet tightly around her trembling body as she rose to her feet, her movements slow, hesitant, as if she were afraid that moving too fast would shatter the fragile hope still clinging to the edges of her heart. Maybe he had left for a meeting. Maybe he had been called away for something urgent and hadn't wanted to wake her. Maybe... Stop. Just stop. She knew better. John Montgomery didn't do mornings after. He didn't do soft kisses in the sunlight or whispered promises of forever. He didn't do love. And she had been a fool to think, even for a second, that she could be the exception. A bitter laugh escaped her lips as she turned toward the bedside table, her gaze landing on the untouched glass of water and the single mocking emptiness where his presence should have been. She hated how much it hurt. She hated how much she had let herself believe, how much she had let herself feel. She had known from the start what kind of man he was, had known that John was powerful, untouchable, and impossibly distant when it came to matters of the heart. And yet she had fallen anyway, fallen into his arms, fallen into his bed, fallen into the illusion that maybe, just maybe, she had been more than just another one-night stand to him. But she wasn't. She was nothing more than a beautiful distraction, a moment of pleasure in his otherwise calculated life. And now she was left with nothing but the emptiness of a room that no longer felt warm, no longer felt safe. With shaky hands, she gathered her clothes from the floor, dressing in silence as the weight of the night before pressed down on her chest like an unbearable force. Every movement felt heavy, every breath a painful reminder that she had given a part of herself to a man who had walked away without a second thought. And yet, as she stepped into the cold morning air, her heart still foolishly yearned for him. Days passed, then weeks, and Stuart did everything in her power to forget. She threw herself into work, into distractions, into anything that could dull the ache in her chest. But nothing worked. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, felt him. The way his hands had worshipped her, the way his lips had traced every inch of her skin with a tenderness that had felt almost like love. Almost. But love didn't leave in the middle of the night. Love didn't disappear without a word. Love didn't abandon. And yet, despite everything, despite the heartbreak and the pain, she still couldn't stop herself from missing him, from wanting him, from wishing. Stop. She needed to move on. She needed to forget. But fate had other plans. The nausea started slowly, just a dull discomfort in the mornings, something she brushed off as stress. But then it became more frequent, more intense, and when she finally took the test, her hands trembling as she stared at the 2 pink lines, reality crashed into her with the force of a tidal wave. She was pregnant. John Montgomery's baby was growing inside her. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet, her breath catching in her throat. As she pressed a hand to her flat stomach, a storm of emotions swirling inside her. Fear, shock, disbelief, and then, above all else, love. This was his child, their child. And even though John had abandoned her, even though he had left without a second glance, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would love this baby with everything she had. She would raise this child alone if she had to. She would give them a life filled with warmth and happiness, even if it meant never seeing John Montgomery again. Because for the first time in weeks, she wasn't thinking about him. She wasn't thinking about the pain or the heartbreak or the cold emptiness he had left behind. She was thinking about the tiny life growing inside her, and suddenly, for the first time since that fateful morning, she wasn't alone. The city that once held memories of passion and heartbreak faded into the distance as Stuart boarded a bus with nothing but a suitcase filled with a few belongings and a heart that carried the weight of a love that had never truly belonged to her. The moment she had discovered she was pregnant, she knew she couldn't stay, not in a place where every street, every corner, every breath carried the ghost of John Montgomery. She needed to leave, to escape, to carve out a new life where her child wouldn't be shadowed by the absence of a father who had never even known he existed. The journey was long, the road ahead uncertain, but as she placed a protective hand over her growing belly, she whispered to the tiny life inside her, "I will love you enough for both of us." And with that promise, she left behind the towering skyscrapers, the cold city streets, and the painful memories of a night that had changed everything. She found solace in a small town nestled between rolling green hills, a place untouched by the ruthless ambition and relentless pace of the city she had once called home. Here, life was slower, quieter, simpler, but that didn't mean it was easy. Stuart had nothing but a few savings, barely enough to secure a tiny apartment with peeling wallpaper and creaky floors. It wasn't much, but it was home, and as her belly grew, so did her determination. She found work at a local cafe, the pay meager, the hours long, but she never complained. She worked until her feet ached, until exhaustion threatened to consume her, until the weight of being alone pressed heavily against her chest. But no matter how tired she was, no matter how many times she had to count every dollar to make sure she could afford rent, food, and the prenatal vitamins she desperately needed, she never regretted her decision. Because every time she felt the tiny flutters inside her, the gentle kicks against her ribs, she knew she had made the right choice. This baby was her everything. Nights were the hardest. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, one hand resting on her swollen belly, wondering if John ever thought about her, about them, about the possibility of what they could have been. Did he ever feel a strange emptiness and not know why? Did he ever wake up in the middle of the night, haunted by a name he had tried to forget? Or was she truly nothing more than a fleeting moment in his life, easily discarded and forgotten? The thought made her chest ache, but she pushed it away. She couldn't afford to dwell on the past. She had a future to build, a future for her child. And then, on a stormy night with rain lashing against the windows and the wind howling through the cracks of her tiny apartment, she brought her son into the world. The pain was unbearable, searing through her like fire, her cries swallowed by the howling wind outside. She'd never felt more alone, never wished more desperately for someone to hold her hand, to whisper words of encouragement, to tell her she wasn't alone. But there was no one, no family, no friends, no John. Just her battling through the agony, bringing life into a world that had already abandoned her. And then, just as she thought she couldn't bear it any longer, a tiny, fragile cry pierced through the storm, and in that instant, everything changed. Tears streamed down her face as she held him for the first time, his small body warm against her chest, his heartbeat a perfect rhythm that matched her own. He was beautiful. So incredibly beautiful, with soft tufts of dark hair and a delicate face that made her heart swell with a love she had never known was possible. But it was when he opened his eyes for the first time that she felt her breath catch in her throat. Piercing blue. The same shade as his father's. The same intensity. The same depth. For a moment it felt as if she were staring into John's soul, as if he were there, watching her, seeing what he had left behind. Her heart twisted painfully, but she refused to let the sorrow take hold. This was her son, and she would not let him feel the absence of the man who had unknowingly given him life. She named him Liam, a strong name, a name that carried hope, resilience, and a future that would not be defined by the past. And from that moment on, Stuart devoted herself entirely to him. Every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every moment of loneliness was worth it just to see his tiny fingers curl around hers, just to hear his soft breathing as he slept against her chest, just to watch him grow. But it wasn't easy. The struggles mounted as the months passed, each day presenting new challenges, new hurdles she had to overcome alone. Money was tight, always tight. There were nights she went to bed hungry, choosing to feed Liam instead, rocking him to sleep even as her own body cried out for nourishment. There were days she had to work double shifts, forcing herself to smile at customers while exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. And then there were the questions, the innocent, curious questions from townsfolk who didn't understand why a young woman was raising a child alone. Some pitied her. Some judged her, some whispered behind her back, but none of it mattered, because Liam was her world. As he grew, his resemblance to John became undeniable. The same sharp features, the same confident tilt of his chin, the same piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. And with every passing day, it became harder to ignore the truth. John Montgomery had a son. A son he didn't know existed, a son who was growing up without a father. Would he care if he knew? Would he have stayed if she had told him? Or would he have walked away all the same, just as he had that morning after their night of passion? The thought haunted her, but she pushed it aside. It didn't matter anymore. She had built a life for Liam, a life filled with love, warmth, and devotion. He didn't need a father, but fate had a cruel sense of irony, because no matter how much Stuart tried to keep the past buried, no matter how fiercely she protected the world she had created for her son, destiny had other plans. And soon, John Montgomery, the man who had left her broken and alone, would come crashing back into their lives in a way neither of them could have ever expected. The years passed, yet nothing truly changed in John Montgomery's life. He remained the same, powerful, ruthless, and emotionally detached, the CEO of one of the largest business empires in the country. His name was known in every corner of the corporate world, his influence undeniable, his wealth growing beyond measure. He had everything, luxury, status, control. But somehow, he had nothing at all. His life was a perfectly crafted illusion, a gilded cage that held him prisoner to the choices he had made. He filled his days with business deals, signing contracts worth millions, making decisions that shaped the economy, surrounded by people who worshipped him for his power, but never truly saw the man beneath the title. His nights were just as empty, spent in high-end clubs, exclusive parties, drowning himself in expensive whiskey, and meaningless encounters with women who desired only his wealth and status. They threw themselves at him, hoping to claim a piece of his empire, hoping to be the one to tame the infamous John Montgomery. But they never lasted. They never touched his soul. They never made him feel, because the truth was, John hadn't truly felt anything in 4 years, not since that night, not since Stuart. But he refused to acknowledge it. He convinced himself it was nothing, just another fleeting encounter in a long list of women who had come and gone. He convinced himself she was just another name, another face, another moment that had no real meaning. But deep down, in the quietest corners of his soul, he knew he was lying to himself, because no matter how many nights he spent with other women, no matter how many distractions he surrounded himself with, the truth never changed. No one had ever made him feel the way Stuart had. No one ever could. Yet, he buried that truth beneath layers of arrogance and denial. He told himself he didn't care, that it was better this way. Love was a weakness, an illusion, a distraction he could not afford. He had seen what love did to people. It made them vulnerable, it made them reckless, it made them lose control. And John Montgomery never lost control. He had built his empire with precision, with calculation, with an unshakable grip on everything and everyone around him. Feelings had no place in his world. Emotions were a liability. So he locked them away deep inside where they could never touch him. He surrounded himself with cold luxury. His penthouse, a masterpiece of modern architecture, towering over the city like a symbol of his untouchable status, filled with the finest things money could buy. But no matter how many luxuries he owned, no matter how many nights he spent in his king-sized bed, surrounded by silk sheets and the scent of expensive cologne, he always woke up feeling the same: empty, restless, lost. He told himself it was just stress, just the weight of his responsibilities, just the consequence of a life spent chasing success. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the city was quiet and there was no one around to distract him, his mind would wander back to her, to that night, to the way she had felt in his arms, to the way her lips had tasted, to the way she had looked at him, as if he were more than just a powerful CEO, more than just a man with wealth and influence, as if he were someone worth loving. And it haunted him. It tormented him, because no one had ever looked at him like that since, and no matter how hard he tried, he could never quite forget the way it had felt, the way she had felt. But he refused to dwell on it. He buried himself deeper into his work, pushing harder, striving for more, drowning himself in numbers and profits, acquisitions and expansions. He built his empire higher, stronger, untouchable, hoping that if he just kept moving forward, if he just kept chasing more, the emptiness inside him would eventually disappear. But it never did. It only grew. And the more he tried to ignore it, the worse it became. He had spent years convincing himself that he didn't need love, that he didn't need anyone, that emotions were useless distractions. But deep down, in the silence of his own heart, he knew he was lying. Because no matter how powerful he became, no matter how many deals he closed, no matter how many women he had in his bed, he still felt alone. And he hated it. And then, one ordinary evening, everything changed. Fate, the one force he had never been able to control, had other plans for him. A moment, a single second, a twist of destiny he never saw coming, was about to shatter the carefully built walls around his heart. And when it happened, when he saw her again, when he saw the truth she had been hiding, his world would never be the same again. Because in that moment, John Montgomery would come face to face with the one thing he had spent 4 years trying to forget. And this time, there would be no running away. The evening air was crisp, the city alive with its usual chaos. Cars honking, people bustling about, neon lights flickering against the darkening sky. John Montgomery, the ever-powerful CEO, stepped out of his towering glass building, his mind preoccupied with the usual thoughts of business deals, stock values, and expansion plans. It was supposed to be just another night, another moment of routine, another step in his carefully controlled life. But fate had never been something he could control. and in the next breath his world came crashing to a halt. His feet stilled, his heart stopped, his breath caught in his throat as his sharp gaze landed across the street on a vision that shattered everything he thought he knew. Stuart. His mind blanked, his body frozen in place, as if the entire universe had conspired to make him witness this moment. She was standing there, just a few feet away, her figure illuminated by the golden streetlights. Her beauty unchanged, no, even more breathtaking than he remembered. Her hair, once cascading in loose waves, was now tied back neatly, and her face carried a quiet strength he had never seen before. But it wasn't just Stuart that made his heart pound in his chest like a drum of war. It was the small boy she held in her arms, a child who looked no older than 4, his tiny hands clutching onto her coat, his innocent gaze scanning the world with curiosity. And then John saw it, the unmistakable, undeniable, soul-shattering truth. The boy had his eyes deep, piercing blue, the exact same shade that stared back at him every morning in the mirror. It was like looking into a smaller reflection of himself, like fate had taken his very essence and carved it into this child. His mind raced, his pulse thundering in his ears, as the realization struck him like a lightning bolt. Could it be? Could that child be his? His stomach twisted, a foreign feeling of panic rising in his chest, battling against the sheer disbelief flooding his veins. It couldn't be. It shouldn't be. But there he was, flesh and blood, standing right there in Stuart's arms, looking every bit like a Montgomery heir. John's throat went dry, his fingers curling into fists at his sides as he struggled to breathe, struggled to comprehend the impossible. Had she really? Had she carried his child all these years? Had she kept this secret from him while he lived in ignorant bliss, believing their night had ended in nothing but a memory? Had he unknowingly abandoned his own son? A storm raged inside him, a hurricane of emotions he wasn't prepared to face. Anger, shock, confusion, an overwhelming sense of loss. It all crashed into him at once, suffocating him, drowning him in the weight of what he was seeing. His eyes never left Stuart, watching as she tenderly adjusted the boy's jacket, her touch gentle, motherly, loving. She'd moved on. She had built a life without him. And that little boy, his son, if fate was cruel enough to confirm it, had grown up without ever knowing who he was. His entire world tilted on its axis, the past 4 years flashing before his eyes like a cruel joke. The nights he had spent drowning himself in whiskey, the meaningless encounters, the emptiness that had plagued him. Had he been searching for something he had already lost? Had he been missing a part of himself all along, without even knowing it? The thought made his blood run cold. His child. A son he had never met. A son he hadn't even known existed. He felt a sharp pain in his chest, a foreign ache that had nothing to do with business, power, or ambition. It was deeper, more personal, something raw and unfamiliar. Regret. Guilt. He had prided himself on being in control of everything, on knowing every detail, on ensuring nothing ever slipped past him. Yet here he was, standing on the edge of a reality he had never even considered, facing the consequences of a night he had walked away from without a second thought. He had left Stuart in that hotel room, never looking back, never questioning what he had lost in the process. And now he was paying the price. His hands trembled slightly, his jaw tightening as he tried to contain the storm within him. He wanted to march across the street, to grab Stuart, to demand answers, to ask her why she had kept this from him, why she had never come to him, why she had let him live in ignorance while she carried the weight of their child alone. He wanted to know everything, but he couldn't move. His body refused to cooperate, locked in place by the sheer force of emotions flooding through him. He had faced ruthless businessmen, conquered hostile takeovers, built an empire from the ground up, but this was something else entirely. This was real. This was personal. This was the one thing he couldn't calculate, couldn't manipulate, couldn't walk away from. And then, as if the universe wanted to twist the knife deeper, Stuart turned. Her gaze lifted, her eyes scanning the street absent-mindedly. And then they met his. For a heartbeat, time stopped. The noise of the city faded into nothing, the air between them thick with a history neither of them could escape. Stuart's lips parted slightly, her eyes widening in shock, in recognition, in something he couldn't quite name. He saw a flicker of something in her expression. Was it fear, anger, pain? He didn't know, but what he did know was that in that single moment, everything changed, because in her arms the little boy turned too, his innocent blue eyes locking onto John's, blinking up at him in curiosity, and John felt his world crumble. There was no denying it now. The truth was staring him right in the face, and John Montgomery had never been more terrified in his entire life. The night was thick with tension, the air carrying an eerie stillness that wrapped around John like an unrelenting force. His breaths were uneven, his pulse a deafening roar in his ears as he trailed behind Stuart, his eyes never leaving her figure. Every step she took felt like a dagger to his chest, every moment that passed deepening the suffocating weight pressing down on him. He had spent years thinking he was in control of his life, ruling his empire with an iron fist, ensuring that nothing and no one could shake him. And yet, here he was, shaken to his very core by the sight of a little boy, a child that could very well be his own flesh and blood. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, his hands clenching into fists as emotions he had buried long ago came rushing to the surface, threatening to drown him. He had always been the type of man who dictated the course of his life, who never allowed fate to interfere, but now fate had thrown him into a storm he never saw coming, and he was utterly powerless against it. His steps were slow, calculated, but his heart raced ahead, urging him forward, pushing him toward the truth he both feared and desperately needed to hear. Stuart stopped in front of a small cafe, adjusting the little boy in her arms as she reached for the door. John's breath hitched as he saw her tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, a motion so familiar, so achingly nostalgic that it sent a sharp pang through his chest. How many nights had he spent remembering the way she used to look at him? How many times had he tried to drown out the memory of her soft whispers, her warm touch, the way she made him feel things he had never wanted to feel? He had walked away from her, believing that one night had been nothing more than a fleeting moment of weakness, a distraction in his otherwise carefully structured life. But now, standing here, watching her cradle a child who looked just like him, he realized how blind he had been. This wasn't just a night of passion he had left behind. This was his past, his present, and possibly his future. A storm raged inside him as he stepped forward, his body moving on its own, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. He wasn't the type of man who second-guessed himself, who hesitated, but tonight was different. Tonight, he was no longer just John Montgomery, the ruthless billionaire, the man feared by boardrooms and admired by countless women. Tonight, he was just a man standing before the woman he had abandoned, before the child who could be his son, before a truth that could change everything. His throat was dry as he took another step, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stuart." She froze. The name fell from his lips like a prayer, like a plea, and when she turned, he saw everything he had been running from reflected in her eyes. Shock, pain, anger, and something deeper, something raw, something vulnerable, something he wasn't sure he deserved to see. His breath caught in his throat as their gazes locked, the past crashing over them like a tidal wave. For 4 years they had lived separate lives, But in this moment, it was as if time had collapsed, bringing them back to that night, the night that changed everything. He saw her grip tighten around the child, her body going rigid as she took a cautious step back. It was instinctual, protective, as if she were shielding her son from the storm brewing in John's eyes. And it was in that moment that John knew. He already knew the answer, before he even asked the question. Still, he had to hear it from her. He had to hear the words that would either shatter him completely or give him a reason to fight. His voice was unsteady, betraying the emotions surging through him. "Is he my son?" The words barely made it past his lips, a mixture of fear and hope lacing his tone. The silence that followed was agonizing, stretching between them like an invisible thread, tightening around his throat. He saw the hesitation flicker in Stuart's eyes. The war she was fighting within herself. Would she deny it? Would she lie to him? Would she turn her back on him the way he had once turned his back on her? His hands trembled at his sides as he waited, every second stretching into eternity. And then she nodded. "Yes, John. He's yours." The world tilted. The ground beneath him felt unsteady, as if the very foundation of his existence had been ripped away. The confirmation sent a jolt through his system, knocking the air from his lungs, leaving him raw and exposed. He staggered back slightly, his mind spinning, his heart pounding so violently he thought it might break apart. His son. He had a son. A 4-year-old boy with his eyes, his blood, his legacy. A child he had unknowingly abandoned, a child who had grown up without ever knowing his father. The realization struck him like a blade, slicing through his chest, leaving him breathless. He had missed everything. His first words, his first steps, his laughter, his cries. Every moment, every milestone, every memory. He had missed it all. And it was his fault. Guilt wrapped around him like chains, tightening with every heartbeat. He had spent the last 4 years living a life of luxury, indulging in meaningless distractions, while Stuart had been alone, raising their child without him. He had thought of her from time to time, wondered what had become of her, but never in his wildest dreams had he imagined this. His throat burned, his hands shaking as he looked at the little boy in Stuart's arms. The boy who was his, the boy who should have been part of his life all along. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words refused to come. How did one even begin to atone for something like this? How did he ask for a place in a life he had walked away from? Stuart's gaze was unreadable, her grip still firm around their son, as if she was bracing herself for whatever came next. John swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper as he took a step forward. I didn't know. It was the truth, but it felt hollow, inadequate. What difference did it make now? He had still left. He had still failed them. But he wasn't going to run this time. He couldn't, not when the most important thing in his life was standing right in front of him. His gaze locked onto Stuart's, desperation flickering in his eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice cracked slightly, the weight of everything crashing down on him. But Stuart only sighed, her expression unreadable, her eyes holding years of pain, of loneliness, of a battle she had fought on her own. And as John stood there drowning in emotions he had never faced before, one thing became painfully, undeniably clear. This wasn't just about a shocking revelation. This was about redemption, about proving himself, about earning back the trust of the woman he had hurt and the son he had never known. And for the first time in his life, John Montgomery, the man who had always had the world at his feet, felt utterly, hopelessly afraid. The weight of guilt was suffocating, an unbearable storm raging inside John's chest as he stood before Stuart, his heart hammering like a relentless drum, his mind drowning in the reality of what he had done. He had walked away from her that night, never once looking back, never once considering that in his absence a life had been growing, a child had been born, a love had been shattered. Now, standing before the woman he had wronged, before the son he had unknowingly abandoned, the realization of his mistakes bore down on him with a force so crushing it made it hard to breathe. His entire existence had been built on control, on power, on ensuring that nothing in this world could shake him. But this moment had shattered him completely. He had spent years chasing success, drowning himself in wealth, power, and meaningless encounters, but none of it had filled the void inside him. And now, seeing Stuart, seeing the fierce protectiveness in her eyes, seeing the child he had missed 4 years of, he knew what the void had been. It had been them. The life he had left behind, the love he had abandoned, the family he had never even known he had. And now, all he could do was beg for a second chance, for a chance to fix the unfixable, to rebuild what he had broken. His voice trembled with raw desperation as he stepped closer, every inch of him screaming to bridge the distance, to reach for the only thing that had ever truly mattered. I need to see him. I need to know him. The words felt like a plea, an admission of a truth that had been buried too long, a confession of just how deeply he had failed. His hands clenched at his sides as he stared at Stuart, silently praying, silently hoping. But the look in her eyes told him that this wasn't going to be easy. And why should it be? Why should she open her heart to the very man who had left her to suffer alone? Stuart's eyes darkened, a storm of emotions swirling behind them. Anger, hurt, distrust, and something else, something deeper, something that made John's heart squeeze painfully in his chest. She had loved him once. He had felt it in the way she had touched him that night, in the way she had surrendered to him with every fiber of her being, in the way she had whispered his name like a prayer. But that love had been tainted, broken by the choices he had made, and now all that was left between them was pain. Her grip tightened around the little boy, her body stiff as though shielding their child from the storm brewing in John's soul. And when she spoke, her voice was sharp, unwavering, cutting through him like a blade. "You left me, John. Why should I trust you now?" The question sliced through him, an open wound that bled deeper with every passing second. He wanted to tell her he had changed, that he wasn't the same cold-hearted man who had walked away without a second thought. But the truth was, he didn't even know if he deserved her trust. How could he? He had left her alone, pregnant, vulnerable, and he hadn't even known. He hadn't even searched for her. He had spent years convincing himself that their night together had been a fleeting moment, something that had never meant anything. But now, standing before her, he knew he had been lying to himself all along. She had meant something. She had meant everything. And that little boy in her arms. He was the missing piece John never even realized he had been searching for. His voice was hoarse, thick with the weight of emotions he had never allowed himself to feel. "I know I don't deserve your trust, Stuart. I know I hurt you. I know I was a coward." His throat tightened, his hands trembling as he took a step closer, desperate to close the chasm between them. "But I swear to you, if I had known, if I had even suspected, nothing in this world would have kept me away from you. From him." Stuart flinched, her fingers gripping their child's tiny shoulder as if grounding herself, as if protecting herself from the whirlwind of emotions threatening to consume them both. John could see it in her eyes. the war waging within her, the memories of their past colliding with the reality of their present. She had suffered, she had struggled, she had endured years of loneliness, of heartbreak, of raising a child on her own while he had lived his life as if nothing had ever happened. And now he had the audacity to show up and ask for a place in the life he had abandoned. She had every right to hate him, every right to shut him out, but still John couldn't walk away. Not this time. He wouldn't let history repeat itself. He dropped to his knees before her, something he had never done for anyone, his entire body trembling under the weight of his own remorse. "I can't change the past, Stuart. I can't take away the years of pain I caused you, but I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my life making up for it, if you'll let me." His voice cracked, his eyes burning as he looked up at her, the woman he had once let go, the woman he now realized he had always loved. "I need you to know that I'm not walking away this time. Not from you, not from him. Just, please, Stuart. Please give me a chance to fix what I broke." Stuart's breath hitched, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something, but the pain in her eyes spoke louder than words. She had built walls around herself, walls made of heartbreak and betrayal, and John wasn't sure if he had the strength to tear them down. But then his gaze dropped to the little boy standing at her side. A little boy with piercing blue eyes, eyes that mirrored his own, eyes that held a spark of innocence and curiosity that made John's heart ache. His son, his legacy, his greatest regret, and his greatest hope. And in that moment, as the little boy stared back at him with unspoken questions in his gaze, John knew he had already made his decision. He would fight for them, no matter how long it took, no matter what it took. He had lost too much already, and he refused to lose them again. Tears pricked at the corners of Stuart's eyes as she stared down at him, her fingers trembling as she brushed a strand of hair from their son's face. And though she didn't say a word, though she didn't reach for him, though she didn't give him the answer he so desperately craved, John saw it, the smallest flicker of hesitation, a crack in the walls she had built, and for the first time in years he had hope. John refused to let go, refused to walk away from the second chance fate had given him. Every morning he found a way to be near them, whether it was bringing Liam a small toy, taking him for ice cream, or simply watching from afar as Stuart led their son by the hand. At first, she kept her distance, her heart guarded, her walls unbreakable, but John was relentless. He didn't just want to be a father to Liam. He wanted to be the man Stuart had once believed in, the man she had trusted enough to give herself to so completely on that unforgettable night. And so he waited, proving himself not through words, but through actions. He showed up. He stayed. He listened. He learned the little things. How Liam liked his sandwiches cut into triangles. How he loved bedtime stories about superheroes. How he had the same stubborn streak John had always had. Every moment spent with his son was a revelation, a chance to reclaim the lost years, to grasp at the love he had foolishly abandoned. And Stuart? She watched it all unfold, her heart a battlefield of emotions she could no longer ignore. She saw the way John looked at Liam, how his deep blue eyes softened with warmth and devotion that had never been there before. She saw how he carried him on his shoulders, how he held his tiny hand, how he laughed in a way that made her breath catch in her throat. This was not the same man who had left her behind. This was a man who was learning to love in a way he had never allowed himself to before. And with each passing day, the anger Stuart had clung to so tightly began to waver, replaced by something far more terrifying: hope. Could she really trust him again? Could she risk her heart, risk the pain of losing him a second time? She didn't know. But as the nights grew longer, as their quiet conversations turned into lingering glances and stolen moments, she found herself wondering, what if? Then one evening, as the golden hues of the setting sun painted the sky in soft, fiery shades, John walked her home after spending the day at the park with Liam. Their son had fallen asleep in his arms, his tiny fingers curled into John's shirt, his face peaceful against his father's chest. The sight did something to Stuart, something deep and overwhelming, something that made it impossible to look away. And then, as they reached her doorstep, as the air between them grew heavy with unspoken words, John did something that made her heart tremble. He reached for her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, hesitant, almost afraid, as if he feared she might pull away. But she didn't. She couldn't, because for the first time in 4 years, she wasn't sure if she wanted to. "I want to make it right," John murmured, his voice low, raw with emotions he could no longer contain. His thumb traced soft circles against her skin, his touch both familiar and foreign, a ghost of the past and a promise of the future all at once. "Not just for Liam," he continued, his gaze locked onto hers, searching, pleading, "but for us." Stuart's breath caught in her throat, a whirlwind of emotions crashing over her, threatening to drown her in everything she had spent years trying to bury. The memories of that night, the way he had made her feel, the love she had given so freely. It all came rushing back, overwhelming, intoxicating, terrifying. A single tear slipped down her cheek, and she let out a shaky breath, her voice barely a whisper, as she admitted the one truth that still haunted her. "I don't know if I can trust you again." John's fingers tightened around hers, his grip steady, unwavering, filled with a silent promise she wasn't sure she could believe. But as he stood there, holding their sleeping son in one arm and holding onto her with the other, Stuart realized something she had been too afraid to admit. She wasn't ready to let go either. Not yet. Not ever. The moment John stepped into Stuart's home that night, the air between them crackled with tension, years of unspoken words, unhealed wounds, and the undeniable force of love that neither of them had ever truly let go of. The dim glow of the living room lamp cast flickering shadows across their faces, but John only saw her, her beauty untouched by time, her eyes still holding the same fire that had once consumed him. He took a hesitant step forward, his breath uneven, his hands trembling as he reached out, brushing his fingertips against the soft curve of her cheek. Stuart flinched at first, the war inside her evident in the way her body stiffened under his touch, but she didn't pull away. She couldn't. Not when the warmth of his palm against her skin sent shivers down her spine, not when her heart betrayed her by pounding so violently inside her chest that she feared he could hear it. "I never stopped thinking about you," John murmured, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes dark with longing as he traced the line of her jaw with a feather-light touch. "Not for a single day." Stuart's lips parted, a breath caught in her throat, her mind screaming at her to resist, to fight, to remember the pain he had caused her. But her body, her soul, had already surrendered to the intensity of his gaze, to the quiet plea that laced his every word. "John," she whispered. But before she could finish, he took another step closer, closing the space between them until their bodies were just inches apart. The heat of him, the scent of his cologne, a scent that had once lingered on her skin after that fateful night, wrapped around her, drowning her in memories she had spent 4 years trying to bury. "Let me love you again," John pleaded, his forehead pressing against hers, his hands moving to cradle her face as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever held. "Let me prove to you that I was a fool to ever let you go." Stuart's resolve shattered, The walls she had so carefully built came crumbling down as his lips found hers, desperate and aching, pouring years of regret, longing, and unspoken love into a single searing kiss. She melted into him, her hands gripping his shirt as if she were afraid he would disappear again, as if she needed to hold on to him to keep herself from falling apart. And John, God, John! He kissed her like a man starved, like a man who had spent every moment of the last 4 years searching for something he didn't realize he had already lost. Their bodies pressed together, molding into each other in a way that felt inevitable, like destiny itself had conspired to bring them back to this very moment. The kiss deepened, turning slow and sensual, the heat between them rising with every flick of his tongue, every desperate gasp that escaped their lips. His hands roamed down her back, pulling her closer, pressing her against the solid warmth of his body, making her feel every ounce of his need, his devotion, his love. "I've wanted this for so long," he whispered against her lips, his breath hot and ragged, his fingers threading through her hair as he tilted her head back, exposing the soft, delicate skin of her neck. He pressed open-mouthed kisses along the curve of her throat, his lips worshipping her, tasting her, memorizing every inch of her that he had once taken for granted. Stuart let out a shaky moan, her hands gripping his shoulders, her knees threatening to give out beneath her. She wanted to resist, to push him away, to remind him of the years she had spent crying herself to sleep. But how could she, when his hands were sliding down her body, when his touch was setting her skin ablaze with a desire she had convinced herself she no longer possessed? "John," she whimpered, her voice breaking, and that was all it took for him to lift her into his arms, carrying her effortlessly toward the bedroom. He kicked the door shut behind them, his lips never leaving hers, his hands never stopping their exploration of her body. That night, they relived the love they had lost, their bodies moving together in perfect harmony, their souls intertwining in a way that made it impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. It wasn't just passion, it was raw, desperate, unrestrained love, years of longing exploding in a fiery storm of whispered confessions and breathless moans. John worshipped her, his hands tracing every curve, his lips marking every inch of her, as if trying to prove to her, to himself, that she was real, that this moment was real. And Stuart, she let herself fall, let herself drown in the overwhelming force of his love, knowing that no matter how much she tried to deny it, she had never stopped loving him either. As the night stretched on, as their bodies tangled in heated passion, as whispered names and promises filled the air, Stuart realized something terrifying and beautiful all at once. She was his, and no matter how much time had passed, no matter how much pain they had endured, a part of her would always belong to him. And John, he knew, in that moment, as he held her close, as he whispered sweet nothings against her skin, that he would spend the rest of his life making up for the years he had lost, because now that he had her again, he would never, ever let her go. The night was painted in hues of silver and blue, the moon casting a gentle glow over the quiet world as John led Stuart to a secluded garden behind her house, where the stars shimmered like scattered diamonds across the vast sky. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of roses and the distant hum of the city beyond. Stuart's heart pounded in her chest as she walked beside him, her fingers entwined with his, feeling the warmth of his skin, the strength in his grip. She didn't know why he had brought her here, but there was something in his eyes, something deep, unspoken, yet so incredibly powerful that sent shivers down her spine. The past few days had been a whirlwind, a dream she was afraid to wake up from. Yet here she was, standing under the vast expanse of the heavens with the man she had once loved so deeply, the father of her child, the one she had spent years trying to forget but never truly could. John took a deep breath, his gaze locked onto hers, his heart pounding like a drum against his ribs. This woman, his Stuart, had endured so much pain because of him, had raised their son alone, had fought battles he wasn't there to fight with her. Yet, despite everything, she still stood before him, still loved him, still made his heart ache with a love so profound it threatened to consume him. He had spent years chasing wealth, power, and success, but nothing, not the billion-dollar deals, not the towering empire he had built, had ever filled the emptiness inside him. Stuart had, Liam had, and he knew now, without a shadow of a doubt, that they were all that mattered. He couldn't let another moment slip away, couldn't risk losing her again, not when he had just found her. Taking a step back, he slowly released her hand, his fingers lingering against hers for a second longer, as if reluctant to let go. And then, before Stuart could process what was happening, John sank down on one knee, his strong frame illuminated by the moonlight, his expression raw with love, with desperation, with devotion. Stuart's breath caught in her throat, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in every inch of her being. "Stuart," John began, his voice thick with emotion, his hands trembling slightly as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I have made mistakes, so many mistakes that I don't even know if I deserve to be standing here right now, asking for another chance. But I know one thing, and it's the only thing that has ever truly mattered. I love you. I have always loved you. And I will spend the rest of my life proving that to you." He opened the box, revealing a breathtaking diamond ring, the stone catching the moonlight and sparkling like the stars above them. "Marry me, Stuart," he whispered, his voice breaking, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she had never seen before. "Not just for Liam, not just because I want to make things right, but because I cannot live another day without knowing you are mine, without knowing that I get to wake up beside you every morning, love you every night, and be the man you deserve. Let's be a family. Let me love you, protect you, cherish you the way I should have from the beginning." Tears welled in Stuart's eyes, her entire body trembling as she stared down at him, at the man she had once given her heart to, the man who had broken it, and yet she had never truly stopped loving him. She had tried. God, she had tried to hate him, to move on, to build a life where he was nothing but a memory. But every time she looked at Liam, every time she closed her eyes and remembered that night, that passion, that love, they had always led her back to him. And now, here he was, offering her everything she had ever wanted, everything she had dreamed of in the lonely nights when she had held their son close, wishing things had been different. A sob escaped her lips as she dropped to her knees in front of him, her hands shaking as she cupped his face, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her palms, the slight dampness of his own unshed tears. "John," she whispered, her voice breaking as a single tear slipped down her cheek. "I don't know if I can ever forget the pain, but I know that I love you. I have always loved you." A choked breath escaped John's lips, his hands tightening around hers, as if grounding himself in the moment, as if afraid she would disappear. And then, with a trembling smile, her tears mixing with his, she whispered the word that sealed their fate, that bound them together forever. "Yes." John exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding, his entire body flooding with relief, with joy so overwhelming it left him breathless. Without another second of hesitation, he slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands shaking as he did so, his heart hammering against his ribs. And then, Unable to hold back any longer, he pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him as he captured her lips in a kiss so deep, so passionate, so filled with love that it felt like the universe itself had conspired to bring them back to this moment. Stuart melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair as she kissed him back with every ounce of love, of longing, of hope she had held on to for so long. They were lost in each other, in the taste of promises and second chances, in the certainty that this time they would get it right. As they pulled apart, their foreheads resting together, their breaths mingling in the cool night air, John cupped her face, his thumbs gently brushing away her tears. "I love you," he whispered, his voice reverent, his gaze holding nothing but devotion. "And I will spend every day proving that to you." Stuart smiled, her heart full, her soul at peace for the first time in years. "Then let's go home," she murmured, and as John pulled her into another tender kiss, the stars above them bore witness to a love that had been tested, broken, and mended, stronger, deeper, and everlasting. The night was drenched in moonlight, casting a silvery glow over the bedroom as John carried Stuart in his arms, his strong hold firm yet tender, as if she were the most precious thing he had ever held. The warmth of his body seeped through the thin fabric of her wedding dress, and her heart pounded wildly, anticipation thick between them. Their wedding had been intimate, just close friends and family, but none of it mattered as much as this moment, this night, where nothing stood between them anymore. As he crossed the threshold, he kicked the door shut behind him, sealing them in a world where only their love existed. His eyes, dark with desire, locked onto hers, and without another word, he lowered his lips to hers, capturing them in a deep, soul-searing kiss that sent a tremor through her body. Stuart melted into him, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer, desperate to feel him, to consume him, to drown in the love that had once been lost but was now burning brighter than ever. John groaned against her lips, his grip tightening around her waist as he carried her to the bed, gently laying her down atop the silky sheets. His gaze roamed over her, taking in the way her chest rose and fell rapidly, the way her lips were swollen from his kisses, the way her eyes gleamed with unspoken need. "You're mine, Stuart," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion as he brushed his fingers down her jawline, tracing the delicate curve of her neck before trailing lower. "I lost you once. I'll never lose you again." Stuart shivered beneath his touch, her breath hitching as his fingers danced over the lace of her dress. "Then show me," she challenged, her voice trembling with desire. A slow smirk spread across John's lips as he leaned in, kissing a path down her throat, his lips hot against her skin, igniting flames wherever they touched. He took his time, savoring every inch of her, as if memorizing her all over again. His hands slid down her sides, fingertips grazing the curves of her waist, before moving to the delicate buttons of her gown. With excruciating slowness, he undid them one by one, his lips following the trail of exposed skin, pressing reverent kisses against her bare shoulders, her collarbone, her trembling stomach. Stuart's hands clutched his shoulders, her body arching toward him, as if she couldn't bear to be apart for even a second. "John." She breathed his name like a prayer, and he groaned in response, his restraint hanging by a fragile thread. The gown slipped from her body, pooling around her like a whisper of the past, leaving her bare before him. His breath caught, his hands stilling as he drank in the sight of her, so beautiful, so perfect, so wholly his. "God, Stuart," he murmured, his voice thick with awe as he leaned down, capturing her lips again, this time with an urgency that stole her breath. His hands roamed her body with a desperation that spoke of years lost, of nights spent alone, haunted by the memory of her. He worshipped her with his touch, tracing every curve, every dip, every soft plane of her body, as if trying to make up for all the time they had spent apart. Stuart trembled beneath him, lost in the overwhelming pleasure of his hands, his lips, his love. Her hands found the buttons of his shirt, fumbling in her urgency to rid him of the barriers between them. John chuckled against her lips, his deep, husky laughter sending shivers down her spine, before he reached up and made quick work of his shirt, shrugging it off in one fluid motion. Stuart gasped at the sight of him, her fingers tracing the hard ridges of his muscles, the warmth of his skin beneath her palms, making her dizzy with desire. "You're perfect," she whispered, her voice full of emotion, and John groaned, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "You have no idea what you do to me," he murmured, his voice hoarse, before lowering himself onto her, their bare skin meeting in a blaze of heat. A gasp escaped Stuart's lips as he pressed her into the mattress, his weight grounding her, anchoring her in the storm of passion that swirled between them. Their mouths met again, their kisses turning feverish, desperate, as hands roamed, bodies tangled, hearts beat as one. John took his time, his touches slow and reverent, as if savoring every second, every shudder, every whispered plea that escaped her lips. "I love you," he murmured against her skin, the words sending a fresh wave of emotion crashing over her. "I have always loved you." Tears pricked at the corners of Stuart's eyes, but they were tears of joy, of love, of finally being whole again. "Then show me," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath, and John did. He loved her slowly, deeply, passionately, their bodies moving together in perfect harmony, as if they had never been apart. Each kiss, each touch, each whispered word of love built higher and higher, until they were both lost in the ecstasy of each other, their souls entwining in a way that went beyond the physical. It was a love reborn, a passion that had never truly faded, a connection that neither time nor distance could break. As the night stretched on, they lay wrapped in each other's arms, their bodies tangled beneath the sheets, their hearts beating in sync. Stuart traced lazy circles on John's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, feeling safe, loved, cherished. John pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his fingers threading through her hair as he held her close. "I promise to spend every day making up for the time we lost," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Stuart looked up at him, her eyes shining with love. "We have the rest of our lives," she whispered, and John smiled, pressing another tender kiss to her lips. "Then let's make every second count." And as they drifted off into a peaceful slumber, wrapped in love, in passion, in the certainty of forever, the moon watched over them, casting its blessing upon the lovers who had finally found their way back to each other. The days that followed were nothing short of a dream, one that John never wanted to wake up from, one that wrapped around his soul and made him realize that nothing in his vast empire, no amount of wealth, power, or control could ever compare to the love he had found in Stuart. Every morning, he woke up before her, just to watch the soft rise and fall of her chest, just to trace his fingers lightly over her skin without waking her, memorizing the way her body fit against his, as if she were made just for him. He would press a soft kiss to her forehead, whispering, "I love you," even when she was still lost in dreams, just to make sure that those words never went unspoken, just to make sure she knew that every breath he took from this moment forward belonged to her. And when she finally stirred, when her beautiful eyes fluttered open and she smiled at him with that sleepy, heart-melting look, John felt like the luckiest man alive. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her neck, inhaling her sweet scent, his voice husky with morning warmth as he whispered, "You have no idea how much I love you, Stuart." She would giggle, running her fingers through his messy hair, teasing him about how a ruthless CEO could turn into such a hopeless romantic. And John would only smile, tightening his arms around her, because he didn't care about anything else in the world except holding this woman, adoring her, making sure she never doubted how much she meant to him. Their days were filled with stolen kisses, lingering touches, and moments that made time stand still. John never let her out of his sight for too long, finding excuses to work from home just so he could watch her move around their house, so he could hear her laughter echo in the walls that had once been empty. He spoiled her not with riches, not with diamonds or extravagant gifts, though he would have bought her the entire world if she wanted it, but with love, with attention, with devotion so fierce it left her breathless. He would cook breakfast for her, though he was absolutely terrible at it, burning toast and scrambling eggs into something completely unrecognizable. But Stuart would only laugh, kissing his cheek and saying, "It's the effort that counts." And John would grin, vowing to try again the next day, just so he could see that sparkle in her eyes. He would take her on spontaneous dates, blindfolding her and driving her to places where the stars shone the brightest, where they could dance under the moonlight with no one watching, where he could pull her close and whisper, "You are my everything, Stuart," before sealing his words with a kiss so deep, so passionate, that the world faded away. But it was the nights that truly belonged to them, nights where words were no longer needed, where John showed his love with every touch, every kiss, every whispered sigh. He worshipped her body the way a man lost in the desert would worship water, desperate, grateful, as if he couldn't live without it. He kissed her with a hunger that never faded, that only grew stronger with each passing night, as if making up for every moment they had spent apart, for every lost touch, every missed heartbeat. He would lay her down on their bed, his fingers tracing the curves of her body as if memorizing her all over again, as if she were the most sacred thing he had ever touched. "I love you," he would murmur against her skin, his lips pressing reverent kisses along her neck, her shoulders, her collarbone. "I will never stop loving you." And Stuart would sigh, arching into him, surrendering to the love that burned between them, whispering his name like a prayer. They moved together like two souls that had been created for each other, their bodies tangled, their hearts beating in perfect harmony, lost in a world where only their love existed. And when the passion ebbed, when they lay in each other's arms, breathless and completely, utterly content, John would hold her close, pressing soft kisses to her hair, her forehead, her lips, as if he couldn't get enough of her, as if he needed to remind himself that this was real, that he wasn't dreaming. Their love became a force that healed, that mended every scar, every wound left by the past. John no longer carried the emptiness he once had, no longer drowned himself in work to escape the loneliness. Because Stuart was there, because her love filled every void, every missing piece he never knew he had. And Stuart, who had spent years believing she had to be strong on her own, who had built walls around her heart to protect herself, finally let them crumble in John's arms, finally allowed herself to be loved without fear. He made her laugh more than she had in years, surprising her with little gestures that left her speechless, handwritten notes tucked under her pillow, roses left on her bedside table, breakfast in bed even when he completely messed it up. He would pull her into his arms at the most unexpected moments, spinning her around just to hear her laugh, pressing his lips to hers and whispering, "I will love you like this forever." And Stuart believed him because she could see it in his eyes, because every kiss, every touch, every heartbeat proved that his love was endless, unwavering, true. As the days turned to weeks, then months, their love only grew stronger, deeper, unbreakable. They built a life together, not just as lovers, but as best friends, as soulmates who had found their way back to each other against all odds. John made sure that Stuart never had to doubt his love, never had to question her place in his life, because she was his everything, his heart, his reason for breathing. And Stuart, in turn, loved him with a tenderness that softened the hard edges of the man he used to be, filling his world with warmth, with light, with the kind of happiness he had never known before. And as they lay together one evening, wrapped in each other's arms, their fingers intertwined, their bodies tangled in the sheets that smelled of love and passion, John kissed her forehead and whispered, "You saved me, Stuart." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with love, and whispered back, "No, John, we saved each other." And with that, he kissed her again, slow and deep, knowing that this love, their love, was forever. The morning light streamed through the bedroom window, casting a golden glow over Stuart's face as she lay in John's arms, her head resting against his chest, their bodies wrapped in the warmth of love. John had never known a peace like this, a happiness so profound that it filled every corner of his soul. He watched her sleep for a while, tracing soft circles on her back, his heart swelling with adoration. She was his everything, his home, the love he never thought he deserved, but now couldn't live without. He placed a gentle kiss on her forehead, smiling as she stirred, her beautiful eyes fluttering open to meet his. "Good morning, my love," he whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Stuart sighed contentedly, her lips curling into a sleepy smile. "Morning," she murmured, nuzzling into him, breathing in his scent, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. It was in these quiet moments that she realized how much she had truly fallen for this man, how much he had become a part of her soul. John tightened his hold on her, as if afraid that if he let go, this beautiful reality would slip away. "I love you," he breathed, his lips trailing down her neck, pressing soft kisses against her skin, making her shiver. Stuart giggled, swatting at his chest. "You say that every morning," she teased, looking up at him with eyes full of warmth. John smirked, tilting her chin up so he could kiss her lips, slow and deep, stealing her breath away. "Because I want you to never forget it," he murmured against her mouth. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, melting into his touch, savoring the way his love surrounded her like a warm embrace. Their love had only grown stronger, deeper, unbreakable in every way. Every day, John proved his devotion, not just with words but with actions, with the way he cherished her, the way he adored Liam, the way he made their house a home filled with laughter and love. As they lay tangled in the sheets, basking in the afterglow of their love, Stuart took a deep breath, her heart pounding with excitement. She had a surprise for him, one that would change their lives forever. Taking his hand, she guided it down to her stomach, looking into his eyes, watching as realization dawned on his face. "John," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion, "I'm pregnant." For a moment, time stood still. John's breath hitched, his eyes widening as he processed her words. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands trembling as they pressed against her belly. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid he was dreaming. Stuart nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, John. We're having another baby." A rush of emotions surged through him, shock, disbelief, overwhelming joy. His lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, he cupped her face, crashing his lips against hers in a kiss so passionate, so full of love and gratitude, that it left them both breathless. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were shining with unshed tears. "Stuart," he choked out, his voice filled with wonder, "you've given me the greatest gift again." He leaned down, pressing a reverent kiss to her stomach, his heart bursting with love for the life growing inside her. "I will never leave you," he vowed, his voice trembling with emotion. "I will cherish you, love you, protect you, and be the best father to our children." Stuart cupped his face, running her fingers through his hair, smiling through her tears. "I know, John. I know." Just then, little footsteps echoed in the hallway, followed by a small voice calling, "Mommy! Daddy!" Liam came running into the room, his blue eyes bright with excitement. He climbed onto the bed, giggling as John scooped him up into his arms, tossing him playfully in the air before pulling him in for a tight hug. "Guess what, buddy?" John said, his voice filled with joy. "You're going to be a big brother." Liam's eyes widened with wonder. "Really?" he gasped, looking between his parents. Stuart nodded, stroking his curls. "Yes, sweetheart. You're going to have a little sibling soon." Liam clapped his hands, bouncing happily. "Yay! I'm going to teach them everything." John chuckled, kissing his son's forehead. "You'll be the best big brother ever." As they sat together, wrapped in each other's love, John knew he had everything he had ever wanted. Money, power, success, none of it compared to the love he had found with Stuart and their children. He had spent years chasing after things that never truly mattered, only to realize that his greatest treasure had been right in front of him all along. Looking at his beautiful wife, his perfect son, and the promise of their growing family, John felt whole in a way he never had before. "Thank you for giving me a family, Stuart," he whispered, his eyes locked with hers. She smiled, intertwining their fingers. "Thank you for coming back to us, John." He kissed her softly, sealing their love in that moment, knowing that no matter what, they would always have each other. And as the sun rose higher, filling their home with golden light, John held his wife and son close, his heart overflowing with gratitude and love. Because in the end, he had finally found what money could never buy: true, everlasting happiness.